During World War II, 16 million Americans served in the armed forces, including 350,000 women. The deadliest conflict in human history, it ended with an Allied victory in 1945, 6 years after it began. But the war wasn't won only on the battlefield. American factories geared up for military production, providing the tanks, rifles, ammunition, airplanes, and ships the U.S. and its allies desperately needed. This brought unprecedented opportunities for women. Before the war, the jobs available to women were those traditionally seen as female: secretary, textile worker, teacher, nurse. The Second World War would change all that, would seem to change everything, at least for a while. My mother-in-law is 93. During World War II, when she was 18, she left her hometown of Bagley, Minnesota, to work in a defense plant on the West Coast, building battleships. Like millions of other women in World War II, she held a job that had almost exclusively been done by men. Then came Pearl Harbor.
I was in high school. I was a junior in high school when the war broke out. And I remember the day they said it, I was in a drugstore buying a paper. I was going to go to church and meet my mother. That's when I heard it over the radio that we were at war.
I had seen the posters. I had heard about Rosie the Riveter and Wendy the Welder, women who were tough with a can-do attitude, whose spirit and patriotism were celebrated on magazine covers and in popular songs. I wanted to find out, what was it like to be a woman fighting against Hitler in the factory, while men were hunkered down in foxholes overseas? I spent some time with my mother-in-law, Genevieve Goodnough. We talked about her role in the war and looked at some photos. She was a welder, like Wendy, but her story wasn't what I thought it would be.
I was born in Petersburg, North Dakota, and from there we moved to Whitehorse, North Dakota, when I was still very little. It wasn't very big. There were only 8 in my class when I started school in the first grade. I remember my oldest brother putting me on his shoulders and carrying me to school in the wintertime when it was a lot of snow.
In 6th grade, she moved to Bagley, a town in northwestern Minnesota of about 2,000 people, where she would graduate from high school.
Oh my, I was a runner-up for the homecoming queen, but I didn't make it. The gal in the middle, she was the queen, and she married my cousin Wallace.
Boys in her graduating class would soon be called to serve in the Second World War. All men from 18 to 45 were now subject to the draft.
Well, my oldest brother was too old to go, but my other brother, Raymond, and the other one, Donald, both had to go. And Raymond was in the South Pacific, and Donald was in Italy. And we would write back and forth. But I remember the letters. So much of it is cut out of the letters. They were afraid that something would be read that shouldn't be there.
Here's an incident to illustrate how our enemies talk, trust, and are criminally careless.
With more than half of all American men under 50 serving in the military, women were needed to do the jobs men had left behind. They were recruited through government campaigns that appealed to their patriotism.
Since October 16, 1940, millions of American men have joined the armed forces to defend our country and our democratic way of life. Here in this modern supercharger plant, the manpower shortage is being solved by training women to do almost the entire job. Waitresses, sales girls, these girls are now ready to tackle the work of producing weapons and equipment essential to our armed forces.
But patriotism wasn't necessarily the reason more than 5 million women entered the workforce during the war. America was just recovering from the Great Depression, and times were still hard. I imagine Jen, a teenage girl leaving Bagley, Minnesota behind, boarding a train alone to travel 1,600 miles for a job on the West Coast. But in fact, her mom and dad also needed work. They came along.
After graduation, my mother and dad and I all took the train out to Portland because my oldest brother was there, and my mother and dad got work on the ships, and I went to welding school for a few weeks and learned how to weld, and I was put on the first plates that were welded together.
It was hard work, but being an 18-year-old girl and only 5'2" was an advantage, one her employers were eager to make use of.
Any small places that they needed somebody, then they would get me because I was little and hoist me up in those little places, and I'd weld up in there, and then I'd have to wait until they took me down. And it was very hot, and we were so warm many times we had to go to the fountain and cool off, wipe our get our faces wet and whatnot, because it was so hot.
It was a time when women were suddenly empowered. They made their own money, doing a job that needed to be done, even if they didn't love it.
I would rather have been doing something else, I'm sure, but it was good money, so we kept on. I don't know how long after that I called my girlfriend, Lolly Archibald, and she came out too and stayed. We had a good time being together again, because we were always together in high school.
Her oldest brother was already in Portland, and for a while they shared an apartment with her brother and his wife.
His wife was welding, and she isn't that much older than me and Lolly, so all three of us went together on the bus to the shipyard, and that's where we were all day and went home at night.
Despite their increased independence, society's attitudes toward women were still steeped in the 1940s, and even the campaigns to recruit women workers would be considered sexist and even laughable now.
This was considered strictly a man's job, but Grace has been doing the work for several weeks, and how she likes it. The only kind of work she did before coming here was housework. On a physically hard job like this, a strong, well-built girl is needed.
Yes, women workers do present problems, Joe. It's tough, I know.
But at least as Jen remembers, she and her female co-workers had no problems with those few men, too young or too old for military service, who worked beside them.
They were very nice. They treated all of us very good.
As the war raged on, with the Allies battling the German army in North Africa and the Nazis closing in on Stalingrad, Jen and her young co-workers would be watching the headlines and listening every night for the latest news. Or so I thought.
I probably didn't pay that much attention. Being young, you don't. Sure, I knew what was going on, but it didn't seem to, I don't know. War was war. I think young people don't think about those things as much as older people.
Despite the war overseas, Jen and her friend Lolly were like young people everywhere, like young people today. Their life wasn't the grim, anxious, nose-to-the-grindstone affair I thought working in a defense plant during a war might be. When the welding was done and the workday was over, they wanted to have a good time.
A lot of times on the weekends we went dancing because there was a place there where they had orchestras. Big orchestras came. I don't remember all the orchestras that they had there, but they were the well-known ones. They had been in a lot of movies and things like that, and we danced to them.
It might have been at one of those dances that Jen's friend Lolly met the man she would marry.
Maybe Lolly found somebody that way. I don't remember how she came to find this guy she married.
In less than a year, the war would be over. There would be parades and victory celebrations, and men would return to the jobs that women had done so well. They had made it possible for the Allies to win the war. Now, many believed, their place was in the home. They were laid off in large numbers. Jen was now 20. She had quit her job in the shipyard before the war ended and started working in a drugstore. Like a lot of women, she had saved much of what she earned during World War II, and that money would enable her to enroll in business school. There were opportunities for women in Portland, more than back in Bagley.
My folks went back to Bagley after a few years, and I didn't go with them. I stayed and worked there. But then after Lolly got married and she had started having kids, so I went back to Bagley. I worked in many different places. I worked for a dentist. I remember polishing false teeth because my dentist made them and things like that. Made appointments and took the money and things.
It was 1948, 3 years after the war, when she was back in Bagley, that she married a guy she had met in high school, Lyle Goodnough.
He lived kitty corner from us. And his sister, Dory, and I were classmates, and we sat together, only found out about him through Dory.
They moved to Memphis, Tennessee, and lived in a trailer while he went to optometry school. Then he bought a small practice in Wheaton, Minnesota, a town on the western border, even smaller than Bagley. He was the town's eye doctor, Doc Goodnough. They lived above the town's only movie theater until they could find a house. She worked for a while as a receptionist in his office before he could afford to hire one. That was the last time she would work outside the home. She would raise 3 children in Wheaton: Vince, my wife Julie, and the youngest, Janet.
And we were there for about 35 years in Wheaton. We liked it very much.
Now she lives in Moorhead, Minnesota, and Wheaton, like a lot of towns in western Minnesota, is even smaller than it was then. In Moorhead, she still kept in touch with her old friend, Lolly, 40 years after they worked together in the shipyard.
Yeah, Lolly and I were such good friends. We were friends until the day she died, I think. I think she had memory loss, and so she wasn't very good at corresponding anymore. But I kept writing to her. Hopefully she remembered some of the things that I wrote about.
Jen still remembers. I thought she would, and maybe that's the only thing I thought that turned out to be true. She remembers being hoisted up in those little places to weld in the sweltering heat. If she would have rather been doing something else, she stuck with it. Like Rosie the Riveter and all those other women with a can-do attitude, she proved she could do it. She could have done a lot of things. She chose to raise children in Wheaton, Minnesota, a choice she doesn't regret, even if she remembers what it was like being 18 in the middle of a war. The ride with her lunchbox to the shipyard every morning, the hard work, the weekend dances with the big band.
It was fun and interesting. We got to see some of the ship before it got into the water. And then, of course, we always watched them when they launched the ship. and the people were out there breaking the bottles. A lot of celebrities would come, lots.
It all mattered. It still does.